We read now from the Gospel of Mark, first chapter, verses 29 through 39. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. When they woke and found him gone, they panicked. Though morning was on the way, it was still dark in the courtyard outside Simon Peter's house. Inside, members of Peter's family were still asleep, including his mother-in-law, resting peacefully since the fever had left her. But Peter and Andrew, James and John raised themselves on their elbows and stared through the darkness, dismayed, at the empty mat where Jesus had been. And they asked one another, "Has he left us behind?" For the last few days, it had been all they could do to keep up with Jesus. He was everywhere. One minute they were on the seashore casting or mending nets. The next they were trailing along in the wake of a miracle worker who spoke with unprecedented authority, cast out demons, and healed the sick with the touch of a hand. Nor were they the only ones trailing. Everywhere they went, more people followed like iron filings drawn along by a magnet. Over just a few days' time, they had moved quickly from place to place, and everywhere they stopped, something amazing happened. Just in the last 24 hours, they had heard Jesus teach in the synagogue. They'd witnessed an exorcism. They'd come to Peter's house and watched Jesus heal Peter's mother. And then, as the sun was going down, they had welcomed an enormous crowd in which Jesus had cured many who were sick and cast out many demons. On their mats in Peter's courtyard, they must have slept deeply. Imagine their exhaustion. But imagine, too, the possibility of panic. Jesus was always on the move. As they struggled to live into their new lives, they must have wondered if they would be able to keep up. And now they had awakened before dawn to find Jesus' mat empty. Considering that he was always going somewhere, wasn't it likely he was gone? Had not he probably left them behind? They had been with Jesus long enough to be attracted to him, long enough to be amazed by him. But they had not been with him long enough to trust him. So maybe, seeing his empty mat, they feared that the transformation he had brought to their lives would after all mean nothing. They'd followed him here, they'd followed him there, but now they didn't see him anywhere. What would they do now in a place where Jesus was no longer present? Now, when I read the first chapter of Mark, it's hard to see any place where Jesus is not present. From the time he appears on the seashore to the end of today's passage, it's like you're looking at a map and Jesus is a moving dot, like on your GPS. And that dot just streaks across the page from seashore to synagogue to Peter's house to a deserted place. When the disciples find Jesus in that deserted place, what does he do but suggest they go on to the neighboring towns, and off they go all through the synagogues of Galilee. Jesus, we could say, is all over the map. Today's passage puts him in 7 different locations at 3 specific times: as soon as they left the synagogue, that evening at sundown, and in the morning while it was still very dark. Why so much attention to time and place? Well, the answer can only be because it matters. The gospel writers don't waste words telling us things that we do not need to know. There's also a lot of characters here: 2 pairs of brothers, a mother-in-law, crowds of people with various diseases. The characters matter too. In every place and at every time, Jesus meets someone. Every place on this map is an opportunity for God in Jesus Christ to interact with human beings and for human beings to be changed. Think about the interactions just in today's passage. Put yourself inside Simon Peter's home as Jesus enters with his first 4 disciples. Inside the house, Jesus receives news from the disciples. Peter's mother-in-law is ill. What's the touch point here? What's the interaction of God and humanity? Only this: listening. Peter, Andrew, James, John, they have something to say, a story to tell, a need to speak. And God in Jesus Christ interacts with their human need by listening. God listens. And then Jesus comes to Peter's mother-in-law and takes her by the hand and lifts her up. God in Jesus Christ interacts physically and powerfully and entirely on the initiative of Jesus, who approaches, who reaches out, who supports and strengthens and lifts. Where the previous interaction showed God receiving, here God is giving. Abundantly and beyond expectation, God comes, God touches, God gives. And the interactions continue point by point all over the map. God in Jesus Christ receives the hospitality that Peter's mother-in-law offers. God in Jesus Christ meets the crowd around the door. God in Jesus Christ gives to those in need of healing, curing their illnesses and casting out demons. God receives, God meets, God gives, God heals. All times and all places are the right times and places for God in Jesus Christ to interact with humanity. And interaction is more than action. There's plenty of action on God's part. God receives, God meets, and so on. But if God is doing all that work and nothing's happening with humanity, it is not an interaction. The assumption of God in Jesus Christ interacting with humanity is that God's action is in some way reciprocated. When God acts, the characters in these stories are being changed. That's how they reciprocate. God's action pulls them more and more to conform them to God's will. How are these characters in today's story changed? How do they respond to God's action? How, for example, were the 4 disciples changed by Jesus listening? Well, how do you feel when someone listens, really listens to you? Affirmed? Recognized? Known? And strengthened? Strengthened to be more and more who God created you to be. Surely the disciples living into their new lives received affirmation and strength from being listened to by Jesus. How was Peter's mother-in-law changed? Well, my goodness, how would you be changed? By the action of a God who approaches you, a God who reaches out for you, a God who lifts you to your feet when you thought yourself unable to stand. Imagine your expanded capacity for wonder. Imagine the increase of your gratitude. Imagine the strengthening of your desire to serve and your confidence in your ability to do so. Maybe you don't even have to imagine it. Maybe it's already happened to you. How about all those people crowded around the door as the sun was going down? God in Jesus Christ met them and healed them. To be brought from illness to wholeness, that is change. To be freed from demons, that is change indeed. The kind of change that brings new choices, new chances, new vistas. New inspiration to believe God, to love God, to hope in God. Moravians might recognize these as the essential response of humanity to the action of God: faith, love, and hope. What a day the disciples have had. What change has come to them? They're changed not only by their direct interactions with Jesus, but in their witnessing of his interactions with others. They saw him raise Peter's mother-in-law from her sickbed. They saw him heal and cast out demons. The interactions they witnessed also provided the opportunity for them to respond in faith, love, and hope. And that explains why Jesus draws the crowds that he does. Not everyone is touched or healed directly in this story, but those who witnessed the interactions were also changed and inspired to follow. And now at last, with the sky darkening and the sounds of the departing crowd still ringing in their ears, the disciples unroll their mats in the courtyard. Night falls, and everyone sleeps. And then Simon and Andrew, James and John wake and wonder where Jesus has gone. Changed as they are, they still have a lot to learn. Despite what their fear tells them, it is not at all likely that Jesus has left them behind. God interacts with humanity not in absence, but in presence. Even in the dark, even in their fear, even this time and place is the right time and place to interact with Jesus, who is still nearby. All they have to do is look for him. And when Jesus interacts by allowing himself to be found, God in Jesus Christ interacts with the disciples by leading them on. Let us go on, Jesus says, to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do. And off they go to the many, many places where Jesus will proclaim the message. Each proclamation is an interaction throughout Galilee and all over the map. The point, perhaps, of this story's containing so many times and places and characters is that there is no place in this story where God in Jesus Christ is not interacting with humanity. Sundown, sun up, indoors, outdoors, leaving the synagogue, entering the house, crowding around the door, and meeting in deserted places. Christ is present in all the times and spaces, and in all the rhythms and all the places of our day. Christ is very nearby, even when we wake in the wee hours and worry that perhaps we have been left behind. We have been with Jesus long enough to be attracted to him. We have been with Jesus long enough to be amazed by him. Have we not been with Jesus long enough to trust him? Do we have faith that he will never leave us behind? Isn't it more likely that a God who is always on the move is gently encouraging us to keep up? One of the hard parts about writing a sermon here at home church is that we start producing the bulletin on Monday, and it is very difficult to come up with a title for a sermon before you've even started working on the sermon. But by the grace of Goslin Printing Company, Andrew and I are given until Thursday morning to insert our title. And this Thursday morning, working on my sermon at home, I texted Jane Shore, "Sermon title is All Over the Map." After a moment, I sent a clarifying text. "That is a title and not a cry for help." Because I realized how it sounded. To say we're all over the map on something is to say we are confused, unfocused, having conflicting ideas or experiencing conflicting emotions. Just like real life. Sun down, sun up, indoors, outdoors, leaving, entering crowded and deserted places. Real life is all over the map. And Jesus moves across that map, touching lives everywhere he goes. Each of life's times and places is an opportunity for God's interaction in our human lives and for us to be changed by that. God listens. God comes. God touches. God receives and God gives. God heals. We respond in faith that we will never be left behind, in love that reaches not only to God but to neighbor, and in hope that wherever Jesus is going next, he'll give us what we need to keep up. Amen.